As we continue our study of the book of Genesis, now we're in chapters 34 to 36, and we have, of course, three major stories. First of all, the story of the rape of Dinah, then the story of Jacob settling within the country, and then finally the story of Esau and the disappearance of Esau from the scene. I imagine that those of you who have at some time or other said it's very difficult to study a book like Genesis because of all the names, you certainly had your fill when you get to chapter 36, because here we have all these names of the family of Esau, and I hope we can clear up a little bit exactly what's going on with all of those names and the pattern or the function that's being taken care of here. Some of you in comments about previous studies of Genesis have made the comment that the early history of the people of Abraham is certainly not one where we find a wonderful, great bunch of people who are all living faithful lives, and that our world by comparison is much worse today. You have seen that there are all sorts of different ways in which the people of Abraham and now Jacob and his family have all sorts of dilemmas. The there's a pattern that we're going to pick up beginning now, and we'll see two of the three events tonight or today in this section, and then we'll see another one as we get into the next unit. And that's sort of the explanation which has been kind of under the scenes ever since Jacob became chosen over Esau. And that's the question, which of Jacob's children will now take on the important role? We, of course, know that the story is going to turn out that Joseph will be that important son. But remember that if you count all the names of the sons of Jacob, Joseph is son number 11. Well, we have to ask, how can son number 11, though the firstborn of Rachel, be the most important, in other words, the one to take over the family, as we know happens when Joseph goes down into Egypt? Well, the first story of why this takes place deals with the middle two sons of the four firstborn of Leah and Jacob. Remember, the four oldest sons are Reuben and Simeon and Levi and Judah. Later there'll be two other sons born. But of those four, we're looking right now at Simeon and Levi. And the issue comes up that, well, the sons are off pasturing the animals, which must mean it's in spring or summertime, that Dinah, who has not been mentioned at all until this point, living in the land in what's now, or what would have been kind of like the area of the Samaritans from much later time, Dinah goes out to visit the women of the land, we're told. The Shechemites are called Hivites, Hivites. You probably have come across the name Hittites quite often, but the name Hivites is not as common. There's a little band in the central part of the country, and there's a couple other cities that show up quite a bit later that are also known as Hivites. Nobody quite knows exactly where they came from, but it would be as if they are also foreigners in the country. They are not the dominant population, and as is typical in many cultures, if you are a minority, you may sort of align yourself with some other minority to gain at least some sort of political clout or protection. And so these Hivites living in the city of Shechem, which is the present-day city of Nablus, quite often in the news in terms of the West Bank area, between the Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim area, which later is the scene of a covenant renewal and where the Sumerians later will have their altar. Well, at this place then, Shechem, the son of Hamor, which means donkey, Hamor means donkey, and some people think that there is something connected here with donkey caravans and a trading kind of culture. This Shechem son of Hamor, whose name gets applied to the city of Shechem, sees Dinah, is attracted to her, and as the Hebrew text says, he humbled her. Well, he raped her, had sex with her, but he's not throwing her away. He is so attracted that he would like to have her as a wife. Obviously, the way in this culture that would have been proper would be to have come to Jacob and for Shechem to have said, I would like to act on my desires. I'm very attracted to your daughter. I'd like to make a peace treaty with your family. and that they might have indeed made that arrangement. Of course, Jacob knew that God had said, don't intermarry with the people of the land, so from that angle we wouldn't have expected it. But Jacob must be old enough at this time that he doesn't feel like he can handle it independently. He waits till the boys come back, and Simeon and Levi particularly here, though he is later connected with worship, there's also a hint about the Levites being those who arm themselves with the sword. We might recognize that much later in Israel's history. The Levites are also the temple guard. They are the ones who guard over all the offerings that have come in and guard over the city and are protectors of the temple where all of the goods would have been stored. So as the plot thickens here, Simeon and Levi say, well, we will be glad to marry or have our sister, and in one place it's even called our daughter, in family terminology for that, intermarry, but we are people who circumcise, and if you want to be part of us, then you would have to circumcise all the men of your town, and then we would agree to have intermarriage. We do not do the custom any other way. The strange thing about this story is the Shechemites are really not just saying they want to have a relationship with Jacob because Dinah is a beautiful young girl, but they say, if we intermarry with them, then all of their cattle and all of their goods will be ours. And once again, the old story of look for the money. If you can see where money can be made, where money can be had, then you can understand why a lot of things happen. And so these men of the city of Shechem are blinded to the danger involved with this. They are only looking for a chance to take hold of much of the possessions that Jacob has gained. And so they agree to have the circumcision take place. Shechem makes the plea, and as the head of the city, he makes a good argument, and so they proceed with having the males get circumcised. Well, usually the second or third day after that, if any infections have set in, or it says in the text, as the men were sore, thus maybe with fevers and weakened, so they're not as much on guard, not expecting anything to happen, then Simeon and Levi come in and they kill the men of the city, and then we're told they enslave the women and the children, and they take all the flocks and herds. So what the Shechemites thought they would do to somebody else is what happens to them. They're all killed, and we don't quite find out that Jacob moves into Shechem and takes over the city that way. We don't hear much more about it than that, but Jacob says, you have made me stink. You have come to the point where you've made me look bad to the people of the land of which I'm a sojourner. Thus bringing guilt or shame, as it were, onto the family is enough to get you in trouble with the head of the family, and by extension say you're not going to have as much of a role in the family. You're not going to have a central role that you might think you'd like to have. Just by way of making the connection with the other two stories, as we look at Reuben, you'll note a very brief note in the next chapter that Reuben lay with one of his father's concubines. Now, it was true that when the father of a family died, then the oldest son would normally become the new head of the family, and as new head of the family would inherit the secondary wives, even though they were older, and in this case, the mothers of some of Reuben's half-brothers. But the real point of it is when Reuben then says, I'll take my father's concubine, he's really saying, I wish Dad were dead already, so that I can take over. And thus he brings shame on himself. We will see that the fourth of these sons, the first four sons of Leah and Jacob, will bring shame as Judah lies with his daughter-in-law Tamar, though he doesn't know that he is doing that, as she is probably heavily veiled in chapter 38. And then all the rest of the sons, except Benjamin of course, are going to sell their brother into slavery. So one of the underlying themes here in Genesis is that every one of these other sons has brought shame on himself because he has done something against the father, against the family. We'll see in the Joseph story that Joseph himself kind of rubs in that he is Daddy's favorite boy, and sort of makes a reason or a case for why the other brothers would not want to love him or care for him. But in spite of all of that, the setup is how does it come that Joseph is the new head of the family when Jacob dies. Normally, when people divide the story of Genesis, they will break it off at the end of chapter 36, as we are doing with this particular unit, and then see chapters 37 to 50 as the Joseph story. But that Judah story kind of intervenes there, and one wonders now why all of a sudden, when you start the Joseph story, is the Judah story going to interrupt? And you'll see that next time. But if we see that Reuben and Simeon and Levi and Judah and the other brothers are all being shown to have brought problems into the father's family, it probably would be a little bit more important to start the last part of Genesis with chapter 34. Once they get into the land, how do they then move from there on down to Egypt? And then the stories of Levi and Simeon here, and then Reuben in the next chapter, and then Judah a couple chapters later after Joseph has these dreams, would explain how did those who normally would have been the most important in the family get set aside. Well, so we have now the situation that Jacob is very concerned that he will be threatened by others within the country. But then chapter 35 goes on and says, well, God was watching over Jacob. He put a panic in the minds of the others. And this is a typical kind of covenant promise. God says, I will be with you. I'll bless those who bless you. Those who curse you, I will curse. And so one of the ways of having those who curse them or threaten their livelihood to be cursed would be to simply have them be in such a panic, be so afraid of Jacob, even though he is small in numbers, that they would not try to cross his path. We might almost think it's probably not a very good comparison, but it doesn't take many members of the mafia threatening to burn down stores in a neighborhood in one of the sections of New York to have the mob be able to control the entire region and have everybody paying them off so that they don't get their establishments destroyed. It doesn't take many people to run a guerrilla operation. It doesn't take many people to throw fire bombs, and all you have to do is have one or two places firebombed, and then the rest of the people kind of fall in line. The panic is what really causes them to fall in line, the fear for their own safety. And so God says, if I want to protect my people, I can do it by panicking the others so much that Jacob doesn't have to lift a finger to protect himself. Well, as we get into the chapter 35, we find a movement in the setting of where Jacob is. He had been in Shechem, which is a little farther to the north, and then he moves a little farther south to the region around Bethel, and that's where he's going to be. His father, Isaac, as we see at the end of the chapter, is still living at this time. Kind of a surprise, because we thought when Isaac was blessing Jacob that he expected he would die any day, and thought he was blessing Esau and then blessed Jacob. Now Jacob comes back, and it almost seems like Esau, even though we were told a little bit ago that he was down in the land of Edom already, it seems that now the reason for this split of the family is they had so many possessions that Esau has to go one direction and that Jacob stays in the country. But in any case, we find that Rebekah's nursemaid is buried now. Rebekah, of course, is Jacob and Esau's mother, so the woman who probably nursed and cared for them along with Rebekah is now buried. And then, even though we have a listing of the 12, or the other, all the children of Jacob, including Joseph and Benjamin, now we find out that Rachel dies as she is giving birth to Benjamin. Ben-Oni means son of my agony, or son of my hurt, or something like that, son of my deep anguish, which she had as she had such a terrible pregnancy and birth that she died as a result of that. But her husband renames him Ben-Yamin. Bin-Yamin. The word Yamin is actually the word for the south, and the direction in which people would face is different in different cultures. Our primary direction is to the north, and so we look to the North Star, and we look to the north, and then that's the primary direction. And if you're facing north, then east would be to the right, and west would be to the left, and the south would be behind you. But in a culture that was much more oriented toward the sun, like the Near East, then the direction in front of you was the east, and so to your right would be Yamin, and so to your right would be the south, to your left would be the north, and the west would be behind you. Third interesting orientation is down in Egypt, where the waters of the Nile were the most important, and so the direction that was in front of the people, their prime direction, was where the waters of the Nile came from, so they would be facing south, and then the west would be to their right, the east would be to their left, and the north would be to their rear, to the back of them. So different cultures are going to have different prime points at which they orient themselves, and Benjamin is usually connected with the south. He's the southern part of the tribes of Joseph. He's at the southern end of those tribes, and is connected even farther south beyond that. And so it may be that in light of this, that the renaming is sort of connected with a location as well. So Rachel, as she dies, she is buried, and in a place that is known as Ramat Rachel, the place of Rachel, just a couple, 3 miles south of Jerusalem, actually between Jerusalem and Bethlehem. We also find that Jacob has gone to Bethel to settle down there, which had been Luz before, the place where God promised that he would be with him. So he stays kind of close to that location permanently, where his family, or where his assurance from God had come that God would watch over him, even though Rachel is actually born maybe 15 miles, 20 miles south of that. Not, Rachel dies as Benjamin is being born. So we can't quite figure out all of where these movements are. We know it's a little farther south yet where Hebron is, where Isaac is finally dying and then is buried. And so gradually now we don't, at least from what I've detected, see exactly when Rebecca died. We see her servant girl, the nursemaid, when she dies, but Rebecca's death I don't think we have seen yet. But we have Abraham and Sarah buried in Hebron. Now Isaac is buried there. One assumes Rebecca is buried there as well. Some of the other family will later be buried down in Hebron, but Rachel not. She is buried where she dies giving birth. Permanent location, why they would have been in transit or whatever, we don't know. The other issue then in chapter 36, as we come to a conclusion of this, is how do we start distinguishing the split up, and usually when you see a listing of the family members of a particular family, that's when they're sort of disappearing from the scene. Earlier we saw that the people of Ishmael's the families being listed, and then they kind of disappear except for a couple brief references. Now Esau, the ancestor of all of the Edomites, will have a whole long list of all of the family members, and we're told about kings of the Edomites that were kings before there were any kings in Israel. Much later we're going to see that Israel, coming out of Egypt, will want to come through that land of the Edomites, and they will say no. So a lot of the later historical events, the Edomites will appear through Israel's history over a 1,000-year period, and all the way to the time when the destruction of the city of Jerusalem takes place. And then beyond that, the Edomites will later take on a little bit different name called the Idumeans, and Herod will be an Idumean, so he will be linked many, many centuries later with this particular family. But you might look on a map at some point and realize that we're starting to find out where do some of these people come from who will later be in historical times a nemesis to the sons of Jacob, the people of Israel. The Edomites are kind of south and east of the Dead Sea. East of it and just a little bit north of the Dead Sea will be the Moabites, and then further north the Ammonites. And you might remember that Moab and Ammon, the Ben-Ami and the Moabites, are the two sons born to the two daughters of Lot. So we have across the Jordan those who are relatives of Lot, and thus Abraham's nephew and grandnephews. and that Abraham's one grandson, Esau, is then even farther to the south and east. You might notice among the descendants of Esau the name Amalek, which comes in there, and the Amalekites are probably one of the most pesty problems for the Israelites in later times. When we get into the story of the rest of the history of the Old Testament, we find the Amalekites attacking Israel when they came out of Egypt, and we find them attacking the people of Saul. We find them attacking the people of David, and there is even a reference to some of the relatives of the Amalekites, maybe way as late as the story of the book of Esther. So some of these peoples who are family are far enough removed that the tensions are there amongst the members of the family. Esau, remember, had married a couple of women from the land, and then marries a daughter of Ishmael. And then we have a whole long list, some of which are names of cities, like the city of Teman is a very well-known city, but also a family member of the Edomites. And at this point then, for all practical purposes, Esau and his family, in terms of individuals, disappears from the scene. So we have come now to the point that Jacob, or as he's now called, Israel, and that's identified once again, even though we thought we knew the story from when he wrestled with God. The people of Israel are now still living in the land. The sons of Jacob are starting to cause some trouble for their father. Remember, God had protected them from Laban as he was chasing after them, from Esau as he comes, had preserved him even though he had wrestled with God. But now he gets into the land, Jacob does, and his children continue to make problems for him, which would now alienate the people who are there. Jacob had alienated his brother, he had alienated his father-in-law, now his kids go on and alienate the people within the country. Humanly speaking, he would have been wiped out. And so we have this little bubble of protection that God says, even though the family's not doing everything they ought to, I will still watch over them, be with them, and protect them. And once again, this insight that God protects people, not because they're good, not because they are accomplishing everything he wanted them to, but because he has kept his promise. And that can certainly be an encouragement for us in our lives when we fall and fail and get discouraged and often go away from God, even though he has promised his grace and blessing and protection and love, and even though he's encouraged us, even when we go the other way. There may be some consequences, but he says, I will not leave you, I will not forsake you. So in conclusion, as we turn now from here on to the story of Joseph primarily, we once again see that God, who had chosen Abraham, is keeping his promises, and that those promises finally are going to result in God himself taking the consequences of all this wickedness of what people do against others, whether Shechem against Jacob or Jacob and his family against the Shechemites. He finally takes the eternal consequences of that on himself. But of course, that's just a far distant story, and at this point all we see is the account of how God is watching over people who are imperfect, making many mistakes, and yet saying, I'll be your God, and I will keep the promises I made in the beginning. Thank you very much for your continued study, and I pray that God will continue to bless you, not simply to recognize that there is sin there, but also that the grace of God is the main story as God continues this passion narrative where he suffers with these people. Thank you. God's